Okay, now that we've got a JSON data file, let's see how we can make use of this to seed and populate our database with some dummy data. So inside the data folder, I'm just going to create a new file. This is going to be a class, and I'm just going to call it seed and press return. And let's update the namespace to API data. And inside here, we're going to create a static method. So I'm going to say public static async task, and we're going to say seed users, and we're going to pass in the data context as a parameter and call it context. And anytime we use static, this is not an extension method, so we're not using this inside a static class, but this means we'll be able to use the seed class without creating a new instance to then use this method. So first of all, we're going to check to see if we have any users currently in our database. And if we do not want to seed any additional users into our database. Otherwise, we'll just end up with duplicate users. So we're going to say if await and then context.users, and we're going to use the anyAsync method. And this determines whether a sequence contains any elements. So we're going to use anyAsync, which is effectively going to say if there are any users, then that returns true. So if that is the case and that does return true, then we're simply going to return to break out of this method. Then we need to go and get our data from the JSON file. So we're going to say var user data equals, and we're going to say await, and we're going to use a file method, and we're going to say read all text async, and then we need to give it the path to our JSON file. So in my case, that's data/user seed data.json. And this is the first opportunity to go wrong because we're using a string here. So do double check and make sure that exactly matches the name of your file. So mine is user seed data.json. And even though I don't think it's necessary to get the casing correct here, if it doesn't work, then do please come back and make sure it's exactly what it is here inside the data folder, and that's the name of the file. Okay, so that's going to read the data from that file, but we can't work with a string in C#. We need to effectively convert this into a C# object. So we're going to use a JSON deserialized method to do that, but just in case we have any casing differences in our JSON file, let's create some options, and I'm going to say var options equals new JSON serializer options, and we're going to say property name case insensitive equals true. And then we're going to say var users equals, and we're going to use the JSON serializer, and we're going to deserialize that into an app user. And we're going to pass in the user data and the options. Now at this point, the required and optional properties in our app user become important, because inside our JSON data, for example, we have a bunch of properties, but we do not have inside here the password hash or the password salt. So at this point, when we're deserializing the user data into C# objects, then we're effectively creating new instances of the app user. And because we're not providing a password hash or a password salt here, our app user, if any of these properties are required and they are not present in our JSON file, then at that point we're going to run into an exception because we don't have them whilst we're trying to create those new app user objects. And that's the reason for initializing the password hash and the password salt with the empty array. And back to our seed method. Okay, so then we need to loop over each of our users. So I'm going to say for each, and I'm going to use the snippet provided in VS Code, and I'm going to say var user in and swap collection for users. And I'm getting an error here because it says the for each statement cannot operate on variables of type app user, etc. But our app user, this is a list of users, so I need to specify list and then add the angle brackets around app user. Okay, so now we don't have an error, we just have a warning saying it could possibly be null. So again, we need to accommodate that as well. So I'm going to say if users is equal to null, then return. And then we need to create the password hash and a password salt. So I'm going to say using var hmac equals new hmac SHA-512. And we're going to create our users just as we did before in our register method. So I'm going to say user.username equals user.username.toLower. Just for consistency, we're going to keep our usernames in a database all in lowercase. Then I'm going to say user.password hash equals hmac and compute hash, and I'm going to specify encoding.utf8.get bytes, and I'm going to use a password of $$W0RD. And for your convenience, I would recommend you use the exact same password here, because that Postman collection that I provided does have users already logged in using that as well. And if you want it super convenient, then I would highly recommend using the same user seed data, because then you don't need to change the usernames if you are using different usernames as well. But I'll leave that up to you. Same with the password as well. But the convenient option is to use the same user seed data that I'm using and also use the same password. Then you don't need to change so many things in your Postman requests. And then I'm going to say user.passwordsalt equals hmac.key. And then we can add these users using the context.users, and we're going to add the user. And this means that Entity Framework at this point is tracking this user entity, but it's still not saved into our database. So we loop over each user in the collection of users, and then below the for each loop we can say await and context and save changes async. So great, now we've got the potential to seed users into our database, and we're going to take a look at creating and applying migrations to our database in code. And we're going to do that when we start our application. So let's go to our program class. And inside here, in between the map controllers and the app run, we're effectively going to use code to migrate and apply migrations and seed the users into our database. So we're going to use using var scope equals, and we're going to say app.services and create scope. And why did I just write that line of code? Well, we need to access a service. And in our add application services, we've registered several services for dependency injection. Now at this stage, when we're inside our program class, we are not injecting anything into this. So we need to use a pattern called the service locator to get hold of a service that we wish to use outside of dependency injection. And that's what we're doing here. So we need to create a scope specifically, and we want this scope to be disposed of. Because this is not coming via an HTTP request that we're doing something with our database. So we have to use a different approach here. And that's the idea of this. We create a scope that we can dispose of after we're finished with it. So once we have the scope, we can then say var services equals scope.serviceProvider. And then we're going to use a try catch block, because once again, we're inside our program class, which means we're not going to get the benefits of our exception middleware we created earlier. And we want to handle our exception at the place where it could occur as well. So we're going to have a try catch block, and inside the try statement, we're going to say var context equals services and get required service, and we need our data context, and we'll execute that. And then we can say await context dot database, and we can use the migrate async command. And if we hover over the migrate async command to see what this does, that this asynchronously applies any pending migrations for the context to the database. So the migration we've just created, that's a pending migration, that's going to get applied to the database. And it will create the database if it does not already exist. And also note that this API is mutually exclusive with another database command we could use called ensure created. We don't want to use this one and ensure created. Otherwise, it's going to try and create our database twice. We'll run into errors because it will say, hey, you've already got this table in your database, I can't do it again. So we only want migrate async or ensure created, but if we want to apply migrations, then we do need to use the migrate async version. And then we can say await seed, and we'll use our seed class and say seed users, and we pass this the context. So if we get an exception, we want to fail loudly. So inside here, I'm going to create a logger. Say var logger equals services, and we're going to say get required service, and we're going to get hold of the iLogger, and we need to specify the class that the logger is running in. In this case, it's the program class. And if we do have an exception, we're going to say logger and log error and specify ex, and we're just going to say an error occurred during migration. And there we go. So do be careful of the location of where this command is executing. It needs to happen before we've actually started our application using the app run command, and it needs to come after the middleware to map the controllers. If you cannot resist experimenting, I cannot stop you from experimenting, but when it all goes horribly wrong, please do come back and put it in its correct location so it goes horribly right. So now we have all the pieces in place. In the next lesson, we'll take a look at how we can actually apply this migration, seed users into our database, and all that kind of stuff.